Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto is an immortal wanderer in fairy tale. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. And check out the description as well. Let's start the video. The blonde 12-year-old sat at a table in one of the few buildings still standing on the island of Tenru, the library. Stacked around her, on table and floor alike, were dozens and dozens of books. Mavis loved books. Books were diverse. They served so many different purposes. To inform, to entertain, to entice, to frighten, the list went on and on. To her, books were a constant companion, always there for her when she wanted to laugh, cry, which she never did. Fairies didn't visit crybabies, or to simply lose herself in a story. Books were one of the few things that she knew of that could almost always put her in a good mood. The only others she could think of were the cute little animals that called Tenrajima their home, and her best friend Sitra. However, there were some days when even she tired of reading and instead craved for the excitement of something new, something different to happen on this lonely old island. It was days like these that made Mavis glad she had her best friend to keep her company. And even if Sitra couldn't always stave off the boredom, then at least they could suffer through it together. Speaking of Sitra, the girl had been suspiciously quiet for the past half hour or so. Listening intently for signs of the brunette's presence, she could hear the faintest sounds of deep, even breathing from just beyond her fortress of books. Mavis gave a small frown. That girl, how were they ever going to meet the fairies if Sitra couldn't concentrate long enough to do a bit of studying? It had only been an hour. She looked behind her and out the small window to check the position of the sun. Oh dear. Has it been that long already? No wonder I'm bored. They had begun reading around high noon, and now the sun was almost finished with its descent. Pushing her chair back from the table with a slight screech, she hopped out of the chair to place her bare feet on the cool stone floor. Doing a light bit of stretching to work the kinks out of her back, she stepped around the books she had amassed on her side of the table and gave her drooling friend a small nudge under her ribs to rouse her. Zara's head shot up from her book pillow and she glanced around frightfully for a few moments before settling back down with a scowl on her face. "Mavis. How many times have I told you not to do that?" the brunette asked with a frown. The blonde girl just smiled back demurely, bringing her finger to the corner of her mouth as she adopted her cute thinking pose. "This would be the 131st time I believe. Unless you count wet willies as well, then it's 156. Sitra just gave her a deadpan look in response. "And yet you continue to do it. Do you enjoy making me miserable?" Mavis looked aghast. "Of course not," she gasped, voice full of sarcasm. Then she reached over to pull on the other girl's cheeks. "It's just that Zara's mean face is so cute. I can't help but want to see it as much as possible." Sitra had no response to the blonde's teasing and simply blushed, refusing to speak for a minute. Finally she spoke up. "It's getting late and we haven't eaten since lunch. Can we please go make some dinner?" To add to the girl's pleas, her stomach rumbled loud enough for both to hear. "Of course. That's why I woke you in the first place, silly. What would you like?" She trailed off, noticing that Sitra had gone unnaturally still. "Someone's coming," she mumbled. "What? People? On this island?" Mavis looked confused for a moment until she noticed that Sitra was no longer standing in front of her. "Sitra? Where are you?" She was cut off by a wailing cry from her friend who had hidden herself behind a large bookcase. "Wah! I haven't spoken to anybody in 6 years. What am I gonna do?" She didn't notice Mavis's face, which looked like a kicked puppy at that statement. "It's like I don't even exist." She despaired, tears rolling down her face, before straightening up and putting her most serious face on. "Don't worry Sitra, leave it to me." With that, she marched barefoot to the entryway of the library to await their guest. 2 tense minutes of waiting later, the heavy wooden door creaked open and the red-orange light from the setting sun outlined a tall figure draped in a thick black cloak, odd considering the almost perpetually warm weather on the island. The hood shrouded his face in shadows, and Mavis noticed that, for how large the man was, he was very light on his feet, making almost no noise apart from the creaking door now closing behind him. When the door finally shut and her eyes readjusted to the light of the candles inside, Mavis squinted and scrunched up her face in an attempt to get a glimpse at what exactly lay under the hood. She needn't have bothered however, as the man reached up with 2 tanned and calloused hands to remove the hood, obscuring her view of the questionable man in front of her. When he did, the girl was treated to the sight of a kind-looking boy that in Mavis's limited and admittedly underused experience looked to be at most 5 or 6 years her senior. His golden blonde hair, a few shades darker than her own, combined with what appeared to be whiskers on his cheeks and a grin that seemed to split his face in two, drew her in for a moment before she shook her head and got down to business. "Why have you come to this island?" Mavis asked in what she hoped was a powerful and imposing tone, though the fact that the traveler's smile seemed to, somehow, widen even farther, gave her the impression that she failed. But still, she kept a straight face as she waited to hear this boy's answer. "Hello there, little girl. I'm looking for a guild called Red Lizard that are supposed to be on this island. Well, at least I think it was this island. I'm not too good with directions." He chuckled a little at some joke that Mavis assumed she missed. "I've checked out over half the island, but I can't seem to find their guild. Do you know where it is?" He looked down at the girl with a hopeful expression painting his face. "Listen, Mr. Naruto." The boy interjected quickly. Mavis quirked an eyebrow at that. No thank you. I was going to have stew tonight, not ramen. Besides, why on earth land would she accept fish cakes from some strange man she just met? The boy's whole demeanor shifted in an instant. His tall and proud posture slumped and the beaming smile dissolved from his face. Mavis could almost see the storm clouds gathering above his head as he wept for some reason that the girl couldn't fathom. He mumbled half-heartedly. "What was that, mister? I couldn't hear you. This whole situation was getting weirder and weirder by the second." "I said it's my name. Naruto. I wasn't asking if you wanted fish cakes. I was telling you what to call me. Naruto Uzumaki." He spoke up a bit this time, hoping to eliminate the girl's misunderstanding. Ooh, that made a lot more sense. She supposed she would have caught on to the fact immediately had she not been so focused on why a strange man had come to their island in search of a long-dead guild. But the look of understanding upon her face, Mavis turned to apologize to the crying man-child. "I'm sorry, Uzumaki-san. I didn't mean to, offend you. I was simply caught off guard by your exclamation." As soon as the words registered in his mind, Naruto reverted back to his initial posture, any trace of tears gone from his face, and his 100-watt smile back in place. "Ah, that's okay. Misunderstandings happen. But you can just call me Naruto." "So, Mavis Vermilion," she supplied. His smile brightened. "So Mavis Vermilion, could you give me some directions to Red Lizard? I have some very important information I need to give to their master. It seems that they're going to be attacked by another guild called Blue Skull." Mavis guessed. She figured she knew where he was going. "Yeah? How'd you know that?" Naruto was impressed. He had to skulk around a lot of seedy bars to work out that information. For this little girl to know what was going to happen, she must have a lot of good connections. "They already attacked." Naruto frowned. "He was too late to warn them." Mavis continued, 6 years ago. The two blondes stared at each other for a moment before the older one broke the silence. "What? 6 years? That's not possible. It's only been," he started counting on his fingers, 3 years at the most. Well, I think it's only been 3 years. I did sort of lose track of time on my way through Bosco. Damn. I'm too late again." He turned back to the girl standing before him with a bemused expression on her face. "Were there any survivors?" he asked, fearing the answer. "Just me and my friend Zara," she replied, hearing a yelp but no movement behind her from ousted friend. "We've been living here alone since then." Naruto frowned hearing this. "I'm sorry I didn't get here in time to warn your guild." He apologized to the girl in front of him as well as the one hiding behind the bookcase. "There's no need for you to apologize for an attack that you took no part in," she said, hoping to absolve him of any misplaced guilt he was feeling. "But is it your job to go around informing guilds of impending attacks?" "Well, I mean, not really, but if I can help once more," he was interrupted. "Exactly. If you can help. In this case you could not, and as such, we do not blame you for losing track of time even if it was for 6 years." At that, Naruto gave the younger blonde a sad smile. "I really am sorry I couldn't get here in time. Can I do anything to make it up to you two? Are you doing okay on this island all by yourselves? Do you need me to take you somewhere on the mainland? I mean, I don't have a boat, but I can find a way for all of us to make it. And then you can find some adults to live with, or you could join a guild and make friends." Naruto continued to ramble on until something he said caught Mavis's attention. "If you don't have a boat, then how did you get here?" she queried with no small bit of skepticism. "Huh? Oh, I just walked is all." He responded like walking across miles of ocean was an everyday occurrence. "You walked across miles and miles of ocean without getting wet? And how exactly did you manage to do that?" Mavis gazed at the boy with an incredulous stare. How on earth land could he possibly expect us to double? She had to cut off her own thoughts because what she saw in front of her was surely not happening. It had to be an illusion of some kind. Maybe she was suffering from hunger-induced hallucinations. Whatever it was, she knew it to be fake because people most certainly did not stand on the ceiling. That was simply impossible, even for someone with, of course. That was it. "You're a mage." She gasped in delight. It had been so long since she'd seen a mage. She had taught herself a bit of illusion magic over the years, but truly powerful magics required teachers to be able to truly master a subject. If Naruto was a mage, then maybe he'd teach her some of his magic. That would be amazing. She had managed to teach herself a bit of illusion magic, but anything else was simply too difficult to learn on her own. Naruto laughed sheepishly and scratched the back of his head. Well, sort of. What I do is a little bit different from magic. Mavis was confused but extremely interested in learning about this sort of magic. What do you mean a bit different? I thought that all forms of magic were created from the same energy. If that's true, then how is your magic any different from anyone else's magic? Is it something other than holder or caster magic? Oh. Is it a lost magic? Naruto smiled at the enthusiastic response, dropping from the ceiling with a cat-like grace to land in front of the starstruck girl, before he responded. Well, I guess you could call it a lost magic, but even that would be a misnomer, because technically I don't use magic at all. Mavis just stared at him, not quite understanding. Where to start? Okay, so I actually look really young for my age. Like really, really, really young. With me so far? He asked. Mavis nodded, even though she was quite confused. He was older than he looked. How much older? What did his age have to do with his sort of magic? She needed to know more. Naruto continued, unaware of the questions bouncing around in Mavis's head. Well, the place that I'm from doesn't exist anymore. It was a land filled with war and violence, corruption and trickery, and the soldiers of the land, called shinobi, carried out missions to kill, steal, and commit all sorts of horrible acts in the name of their village. They used an energy called chakra to perform jutsus, sort of like spells, in order to attack one another and also to assist in transportation. After countless wars and even more deaths, the entire land just collapsed in on itself. Eventually, everyone who could use chakra died out and people developed the ability to use absorb etanano and use magic. Now, as far as I know, I'm the only one left in the world who can use chakra. Mavis stared in awe at the man standing before her. She could vaguely remember reading a tome buried somewhere in the plethora of bookcases behind her that made brief mention of an ancient race capable of performing amazing feats, similar to what they called magic today. It was documented that those people used energy other than etanano to control the elements and even manifest the energy itself into a physical form to use as a weapon. Among scholars, it was generally agreed upon that this energy, which she now knew was called chakra, was the precursor to etanano in magic. If the man in front of her was telling the truth, which at this point she was almost certain he was, then he truly was the last remaining artifact from an age of legends. But then, that meant that Naruto was well ancient. How old are you? She asked curiously. If what you say is true, then that would mean you were at least 600 years old. But then, you talk about your people like you watched them die out, which would mean you were even older. Ah, you're pretty smart, you know that. I am indeed over 600 years old, but I'm not gonna tell you exactly how old. That wouldn't be any fun. So instead, you have to guess. And if you manage to guess, I'll tell you anything you want to know about the world when I was young. Naruto chuckled at the girl's reaction. Mavis looked extremely put out that the piece of living history standing in front of her refused to part with such valuable information. But then, her eyes hardened and she nodded resolutely. I accept your challenge. She announced with the most conviction she could muster. Naruto looked a bit confused at her sudden declaration, but shrugged and went along with it. If it motivated her, then who was he to ruin her fun? Finally, he decided he should get back to the reason he was here in the first place. So if my message is useless now, I guess I don't have a reason for staying here much longer. Unless there's anything that you or your friend need from me, I'll be off. With a smile and a wave he turned to reach for the door. Wait. Mavis yelled, halting his movements. You never let me guess your age. Naruto grinned sheepishly at the girl from over his shoulder. Heh, I guess you're right. Okay, you get one guess. His grin morphed into a smirk when he saw the blonde's face. Only one guess. She hollered. It's near impossible to guess a person's age when they could be anywhere from 600 to well over 1000 years old. Naruto realized that she was taking this little game far more seriously than he was and decided to help her out a bit. Alright, how about this, I am older than 650, but younger than 1000. That should help narrow it down. And I should have specified, you get one guess today. He clarified. Mavis looked confused and Naruto had to concede that it was an extremely cute look on the girl's face. An Edo day. How is that going to help? What are the chances that we'll ever meet again? If you were to leave now, then it's highly unlikely that we'll cross paths at any point in the future, which would mean that I still only got one chance to guess. She began to pout at the thought of losing a source of such valuable information. Also, strange though he was, Naruto was kind and friendly, and she wouldn't mind getting to know the ancient man on a more personal level. She could always use another friend. Plus, she could admit, if only to herself, that for a several centuries old man, he was quite cute. The blonde snapped out of her mental reverie when she heard the aforementioned man speak. I wouldn't worry too much about that. For as long as you stay on this island, I'll stop by every few months to visit, and even if you leave here to go to the mainland, I'm always traveling, and it's a small world out there, I'm sure we'll run into each other again somewhere. Besides, I don't exactly have too many friends. Being immortal, you grow tired of watching everyone you hold dear grow old and die around you. But the friends I do have mean the world to me, and I'd like to think we could be friends. And who knows? Maybe the next time I visit, Zara will come and introduce herself instead of hiding behind a bookshelf. They both laughed at the startled squeak that followed his last statement. One last thing before I go. Naruto's hand disappeared beneath his cloak and reappeared a few seconds later, holding a strange type of knife, the likes of which Mavis had never seen before. Its blade was sharp on both sides down to the base of the blade, which arched out to each side in a crescent moon shape. The handle was wrapped in a tan cloth and decorated with some form of strange archaic writing that she'd never seen before. The bottom of the knife was adorned with a small ring that looked just big enough for Naruto to slip a finger through. She tensed for a small moment until it occurred to her that if the man in front of her wanted to harm her, he could have done so at any point in their conversation, and she wouldn't have noticed until it was far too late. But that thought banished from her head, she turned her attention back to the knife that was now spinning slowly around one of the shinobi's fingers. In one smooth motion, he tossed it up in the air, grabbed it by the blade, and presented the handle to the shorter blonde. Mavis looked at the knife in confusion for a moment and then turned that look to the one holding it. Naruto smiled widely and pushed the strange object towards the girl once more. Taking the hint, she grabbed it from him before examining it in closer detail. She was no expert when it came to blades of any kind, but even she could tell that it was finely made. The edge looked extremely sharp, like even the slightest touch against her finger would break the skin, and the flat part of the blade was a smooth matte black that seemed to swallow the light around it. Once more, she was brought back to reality by the sound of her newest friend's voice addressing her. "That knife you're holding is called a kunai," Naruto explained. "It's an important part of a technique I use that allows me to instantly relocate myself to where one of those is located. If you're ever in any trouble, just throw that kunai into the floor wall nearby and I'll be there to help. Does that sound good to you?" Mavis just nodded slowly, astounded at the possibilities of instant teleportation. She nearly got lost in her own little world again, but was distracted by Naruto telling her to try throwing the knife as a sort of practice run. Nodding, the small girl brought her arm back in preparation for the throw, but was halted by Naruto grabbing her wrist lightly and stepping behind her to bring her shoulders around into a better position. Blushing brightly at the close contact and stammering a thanks to the blonde boy, Mavis wound back once more and then released the knife with all of her might towards the thick front door of the library. It flew a few feet off to the right and wobbled unsteadily, but before it could crash into the hard stones that made up the wall around the door, Naruto's presence behind her disappeared and in the same instant, a bright flash of yellow light illuminated the entryway before dying down to reveal the blonde ninja casually spinning the kunai she'd just thrown around his finger with a smirk, alighting his whiskered face. Mavis gawked at the scene in front of her. Her mouth hung down, nearly scraping the floor while her mind ran a mile a minute, replaying what she had just witnessed. It truly was instant teleportation. There was no lag time between when he had vanished from behind her to when he reappeared in front of her. In fact, it almost seemed like he was in both places at once, as if he had simply told reality that he actually existed at both points in space for that one instant in time. It was the single most astounding thing she had witnessed in 12 years of life, but this demonstration just left her with so many questions. There had to be a limit to this power. What was it? Did it only work over a certain distance? Could it only be done a set number of times per day? Did it harm the user in some way? Just how did it work? Mavis spat these questions out one after another, hoping that the faster she asked them, the faster they would be answered. Thankfully, Naruto began his explanation before the young girl could start hyperventilating. "As far as I know, there's no limit on the distance or amount of times it can be used in a set period. My dad once used this technique to fight an entire army of nearly 200 ninja in under a minute. It takes very little chakra to use, even for someone with relatively low reserves. For me, it's like a drop in the ocean. I'd probably have to use the technique continuously for close to an hour before I started to feel anything resembling fatigue. As for how it works, well, imagine that space is a piece of cloth." He grabbed part of his cloak before continuing. "Normally, when we move, it's in a straight line across the cloth." He drew his finger across his cloak, marking a line of about 6 inches. "Now imagine that this kunai and my chakra are opposing ends of two magnets, in other words, we're drawn towards each other. The force that pulls at us is so great that it can actually bend space." He held the ends of his section of cloak together with thumb and forefinger in order to bring the two objects closer together. "From there, it's just a matter of making a little hole that I can climb through to get from one side of the cloth to the other." Finally, he stuck the tip of the kunai through one side of his cloak and out the other. "Does that make sense?" he asked. He was genuinely curious. He'd never had to explain how the technique worked before. Most people just sort of went with it. Mavis considered it all for a few seconds and then nodded in affirmation. "I think I understand. Just one more question, what is it that makes the kunai so special?" Most of Naruto's explanation made some semblance of sense to her, but she simply couldn't ascertain what allowed a piece of metal to violate the most basic rules of reality. Naruto grinned at the girl's remarkable intellect. He'd wondered if she would ask about that. Most people would be so caught up in other aspects of his explanation that they'd completely overlook the fact that it was not just him working to manipulate space and time. Good question. And the answer is this bit of ink right here. He once again handed her the knife, handle first, using his other hand to point out the characters scrawled along its grip. Examining the knife once more, Mavis paid extra attention to the lines of ink that covered the handle. She had initially passed it off as simple decoration, perhaps a name tag of sorts written in his people's language. Now though, she knew better. She brought it to her face to take a closer look and began to compare what she saw to what she knew of runescript. There were a few basic similarities between the two. Some of the characters on the knife seemed like they could have changed over the years into what were now runic letters, but the grammar and syntax were entirely different. Runes were rather straightforward in composition and read as if you were reading a story. However, there was nothing linear about these symbols. They seemed to swirl together from every direction, intersecting in a maze of interlocked lines. She imagined learning the grammatical nuances of this language would be incredibly difficult but unimaginably rewarding. Looking back to the whiskered man, she explained her findings. You're right about the correlation between runes and seals. From the little I know of runes, the characters are based on sealing script, but the overall organization changed to the linear style that you're familiar with. A consequence of this though is that you lose the ability to have a single rune influence more than the other runes in that sentence. On the other hand, with seals, the structure allows for each character to influence every other character and completely alter their intended function. As a result, something written with a dozen sealing characters would require more than 100 runes to reproduce. Mavis was about to continue what was quite honestly the most interesting conversation she'd ever had, but she was interrupted by a ferocious growl emanating from her stomach. In her head, she began to curse her mutinous stomach. She would gladly go without eating for a few more hours if it meant she could continue this enlightening conversation. She'd learned more in the past 30 minutes than she usually did from a month's worth of reading books off the library shelf. Having another intellectual to converse with was an amazing thing. She truly loved Zara, but her best friend was far from scholarly. She opened her mouth to tell Naruto to ignore her stomach's cries for sustenance, but the shinobi used that moment to take his leave. I should get going. You girls have a dinner to eat, and I don't want to impose any more than I already have. Naruto once more turned to the door. Wait. You can have dinner with us. You don't have to leave already. I have so many more questions. Plus it's dark out now. You shouldn't try crossing the ocean in the dark, you could get hurt. Just stay on the island for the night and you can leave tomorrow. Mavis pleaded with the man to stay so they could keep conversing, but he was having none of it. Don't worry Mavis. This isn't the last time you'll see me. I'll come back to visit in a month or two, okay? The young blonde still looked devastated. And maybe I'll even bring some souvenirs. That got her to smile a bit and she threw back a "you better," causing the older blonde to chuckle softly. Sending one last smile over his shoulder, Naruto opened the heavy door and stepped outside. Zara finally emerged from her hiding place behind the bookshelf and moved to stand next to Mavis in the doorway. The two of them stood side by side, watching the back of the cloaked shinobi until he disappeared into the night. Hey guys, I've never written anything like this before. In fact, this is the first piece of recreational writing I've ever completed. As such, I'd very much appreciate any and all critiques you have for me, hell, even flames are fine. Just something to tell me what I've done right or wrong. On the other hand, you can totally ignore this and I'll just keep writing the way I have been. Spoilers ahead for Fairy Tail 0. As far as the story is concerned, there will probably be 2 or 3 more pre-canon chapters before we get to canon time, i.e. X784. Beyond that though, I really have no idea where to take this. Regarding Zara, as you may or may not know, there is some debate as to whether she is alive or if she even exists at all, since there is no incident of anyone other than Mavis actually interacting with her so far. I believe there is definitely some merit to this idea, but for the sake of my fragile little heart, I'm going to pretend she's alive. Not that this changes much, as her part in these first few chapters is as more of a background character and a bit of a counterpoint to Mavis's outgoing and easily trusting personality. Naruto sighed in relief as he stepped from the churning waters onto the dry sand of Tenryjima's beach. As much as he told Mavis and Zara that it was no problem, traversing miles of ocean using only his chakra was exhausting, if not physically, then mentally at least. Hours of walking with nothing but water to look at in every direction was monotonous at the best of times. When the person doing the walking couldn't even find the legend on a map, let alone his destination, the situation just becomes worse. And while he could always use his handy-dandy Haration, he stopped using that after his first attempt to visit his two young friends when he found out that Mavis had taken to wearing the kunai as some sort of strange, extremely dangerous necklace. A necklace that she almost always kept on her person. Including when she was bathing. That was an experience he did not want to repeat again. He discovered two more things that day as well. One was that Mavis and Zara bathed together regularly, and the other was that both girls, despite having lived in solitude through a good portion of their formative years, knew exactly what parts of a man's body hurt the most when hit. He would deny it until the day he, eventually, died, but he cried like a freshly spanked newborn after their assault had ended. Needless to say that all three were sufficiently embarrassed by what had transpired in that creek and agreed to never speak of it again. Disastrous first meeting with Zara aside, Naruto was greatly enjoying his visits to Tenru over the past year. It had been far too long since he'd last gotten attached to anyone on a personal level. The knowledge that everyone you knew would someday die while you stood by watching, unable to do anything to help, seriously put a damper on that desire. But these girls had managed to worm their way into his circle of trust in record time. Zara's dry wit and Mavis's intellect were extremely refreshing, if surprising attributes to be found in one so young. Every time he visited, which was about once a month, he would bring the girls a trinket of some sort from wherever he'd wandered recently, and they would sit around and talk about anything and everything except for Naruto's home. After 11 guesses, Mavis had still not come close to Naruto's age, and as such was no closer to hearing tales of a time lost to most of history. While disappointed that was no closer to her goal, she refused to get discouraged, always promising the aged shinobi that she would guess it next time. At this point he was considering just telling her how old he was, but the faces she made when she was so sure she'd gotten it right were the highlights of his month. While he shied away from the topic of his home, he held no such compunctions about his ninja techniques. When asked, he would gladly showcase any number of jutsu that he had adopted or created over his long life. He dearly wished that the girls could use chakra or that he had some way of using magic so that he could take them on as students. They had expressed on a number of occasions their desire to learn magic in order to protect each other, and in Naruto's mind, there was no better reason to acquire power than to use it to keep your loved one safe. He decided that if the two of them ever expressed a desire to leave the island, the first thing he would do would be to find them a teacher for magic. The blonde snapped out of his reverie as he got closer to the library where Mavis and Zara would be waiting. In his last 3 visits to the island, he had been assailed by a variety of traps, all courtesy of Mavis. In a test of both of their skills, the blonde girl had taken to setting up a veritable minefield of traps, big and small, to try and guess the ninja's most likely path on his way from the beach to the library. It was nothing dangerous, mostly just things to irritate him that he wouldn't be able to hide from the wanted tactician, like foul-smelling mud placed in shallow pitfalls or slingshots loaded with small rocks, meant to leave light bruises on his skin. Strangely enough, any traps that he could find were already triggered and made for a straight path the entire way to the large stone building. That fact alarmed him slightly, as he should have been the only one to come to the island recently, and Zara had learned to avoid any of the traps set by her best friend. However, he didn't panic because he knew that Mavis was smart enough to realize when she was in over her head. If that had happened, she would have thrown the kunai, and he would have been here to help with whatever was going on. Arriving at the library, he opened the door silently, hoping to sneak up on the girls before jumping out to scare them. Was it childish? Yes. Did he care? Hell no. Using his centuries of experience as a ninja, he crept through the rows of books on his way to the girl's favorite table, situated in the back of the building near the windows that faced out into the forest. When he reached his destination, he did not find his 2 small friends as expected, but rather a single piece of paper covered with Mavis's neat script. It read, "Dear Naruto, treasure hunters have come to the island in search of the Tenru jade. I tried to stop them, but it seems my efforts were in vain as the jade was already gone. We can only assume that it was taken by a member of Blue Skull that managed to survive the attack on Red Lizard 7 years ago. Zara and I have temporarily joined forces with the treasure hunters to ensure that we are able to recover what was lost. Also, more importantly, after beating one of the hunters in a game of wit, he's promised to let me meet the fairies. When I do meet them, I'll be sure to contact you via the kunai so that you can come and meet them as well. Our first stop will be the port town of Harjan to gather any information on the Blue Skull member. From there we'll be playing it by ear, but I'm sure you'll be able to find us. If we don't hear from you by a week after the time you should be reading this, I'll throw the kunai to let you know where we've wound up. We'll see you soon. I just know I'll guess your age this time, so no dilly-dallying. Love, Mavis and Zara." Naruto checked the date on the letter and frowned. It seemed they'd left only a week after he last departed, meaning they'd been traveling with a group of strange men for nearly 3 weeks. He didn't like that one bit. He folded the letter and placed it within a pocket of his cloak, spun on his heels, and walked determinedly back the way he'd just come. He'd have to hurry if he wanted to catch up with the girls and their new friends. He only hoped they didn't manage to land themselves in any trouble in the meantime. As he had arrived at Tenrajima around midday, he made it back to the mainland in time to grab dinner at one of the local restaurants. As he paid his bill, he asked a waitress for directions to Harjan town. Well, he'd been through the town before, he had no idea of its location relative to the town he was in. This wasn't a time for him to be getting lost on the road of life or anything like that. He had to get to his friends to make sure they were okay. He may have trusted their judgment, but there were some things in this world beyond anyone's control. It didn't help that they were going out of their way to find a member of a guild that had completely annihilated their own a scant few years ago. It was for those reasons that he wanted to get to them as quickly as possible. He refused to let his first two friends in hundreds of years come to harm because he couldn't reach them in his core set. He made his way to the edge of town and hopped up into the trees before jumping quickly from branch to branch towards Harjan. He made good time to the small fishing town, arriving just as the sun began to peek over the trees. Unfortunately, that meant that he missed his best chance at gathering information for another few hours. The blonde would have to wait for the bars to reopen before he could begin his task of finding where his two young friends had made off to. Until then though, he decided to rest and refuel, as even for him, running all night without sleep was quite exhausting. Walking towards the smell of bread, he found himself at a small bakery just finishing baking their first loaves of bread. Naruto purchased a fresh loaf for his breakfast before making his way to a quieter part of town to get some shut-eye. He awoke a few hours later to the sight of a small boy no older than 6, about to jab a gnarled tree branch into his face. Slapping away the offending stick, he aimed a glare at the little boy for his rude awakening that sent the child running off back to his mother. Standing up and popping the kinks out of his neck and back, he checked the position of the sun before deciding that it was late enough in the day for the bars to start filling up. Looking in the areas of town nearest the docks, he found a single bar sitting back a ways from the street. Strolling inside, he found far more people than he was expecting, which was good news for the blonde. It meant that this place was a regular hangout for a group of people, most likely, a guild. Naruto ambled up to the barman, who stood wiping down glasses while looking over his newest customer in what he thought was a subtle way. Instead, the way he angled his head combined with the way his eyes were nearly crossed trying to get a look of the blonde without the man noticing, made it look like he was suffering from a severe spinal injury. But the man, and judging by the glares behind him, the rest of the bar's patrons as well, already suspicious of Naruto, he decided to forego subtlety and get his answers in the fastest way possible. "I'm looking for a little blonde girl about this high." He brought his hand just below his ribs, wearing a headband with what looked like little wings on the side. "Have you seen her?" The barman looked a strange mixture of angry, terrified, and slightly hopeful. "Yeah, I seen the little psycho. Bitch comes in here asking questions she shouldn't ask and then tries to kill us all when we don't have the answers. You gonna do something bad to her when you find her? If so, we'd all be happy to lend a hand." He waved his hand at the patrons seated throughout the room who were all nodding along happily, ecstatic to get a chance to pay back the impudent little girl and her blade-wielding babysitter. Naruto only just managed to keep a frown off of his face as he responded in a completely neutral tone. "Actually, that little psycho is my friend. I've been looking for her and my other friend to make sure they're alright. You all have obviously run into them, so which one of you wants to tell me where they went?" He swept his gaze around the room watching as each person's expression immediately soured. Whole tables at a time, men stood up, pulling clubs off of backs and knives out of pockets in preparation to attack the blonde man. The sage sighed, "You really don't want to fuck with me right now. I'm not in the mood to play games." He closed his eyes trying to stave off the imminent headache, but it was no use. The armed thugs took one menacing step forward before Naruto reacted. Spinning back to the bar, he shot his right hand out faster than most could blink, grabbed the barman behind his oblong head, and slammed him face first into the bar. Wood splintered and cartilage crunched as blood spewed from the man's broken nose. Before he could pull himself up, Naruto shifted his grip to the back of the barman's shirt and pulled, heaving the bloodied man up and over the bar. After completing a full revolution in the air, Naruto's dazed and confused victim wound up in front of the blonde, facing the rest of the patrons and acting as a human shield. To complete his maneuver, he reached beneath his cloak, arm re-emerging a moment later with a kunai in hand before he laid it to rest against the barman's throat. The whole thing took 3 seconds. The armed men halted in their approach, gaping in astonishment at what had just befallen their comrade. No one moved for fear that the obviously unstable blonde would snap and kill them all. Naruto just stared unblinkingly at the terrified men's faces. "Now, is someone going to tell me what I want to know?" The air was thick with tension as each man waited for someone else to speak. Finally, after a full 30 seconds of agonizing silence, the barman seemed to have come back to his senses and began to recount what had happened in a nasally voice. "The girl and her friend came in looking for a guild. We didn't want to tell them nothing, so I told them to get out. We tried trapping them in a rune circle when they didn't scram, but she figured we had a rune wrong and just walked out. Then she summoned this big ass dog thing and tried to make it eat us. I told them what they wanted to know and they left. That's it, I swear. The man relayed his story as fast as he could so that they could be rid of the knife-wielding madman. The rest of the bar stared at the blonde expectantly, but he just returned their look. "And what is it that you told them?" he asked when the man seemed finished speaking. Yes, he had heard what transpired in the bar, but that didn't tell him where she'd gone from there. They were looking for Blue Skull. We sent him to Magnolia Town. Not like they're gonna find anything there. Place is a ghost town. Blue Skull's master keeps all the citizens under his thumb. Ain't nothing goes on in that city that he don't know about. Naruto was glad he could get this information from them in a relatively peaceful manner, but there was still one more piece of information he needed. "I appreciate your willingness to share all of this with me, but there's one more thing I need you to do for me." He trailed off ominously to see their reactions, and he was not disappointed. Each thug looked about ready to drop from the palpable tension in the room. Their wary faces grew more and more worried with each passing second until finally, "Which way is Magnolia from here?" The effect was instant. Every single one of them looked dumbfounded by the simplicity of the request. Then came the chuckling which soon evolved into full-blown laughter that finally dissolved into relieved sobbing. Eventually, Naruto and the barman were the only two standing upright in a bar full of weeping men. Naruto just took his knife away from the barman's throat before spinning him around and staring expectantly. The man quickly caught on and said, "Just head straight west from here. There's a path that leads all the way to the town. You can't miss it." The barman dearly hoped that was enough to satisfy the crazed man in front of him. Hopefully this would be enough information and he would leave them alone. He gazed in fear at the blank-faced man for a few moments, but then the unthinkable happened. The stoic man smiled. It was the single most frightening thing that the fully grown barman had ever experienced, and as a result, he promptly fainted. Naruto looked on curiously at the unmoving body of the man he was about to thank, shrugged, and turned to face the other men in the bar. He found them hugging and congratulating each other on the fact that they had survived the harrowing ordeal. They were so caught up in their celebration that the fact that Naruto had yet to leave completely escaped their notice. Rolling his eyes, the shinobi headed to the door and out into the sunlight. Some people were just plain weird. Mavis stood in the main room of her new guild. It had taken nearly 2.5 weeks for the construction crew to renovate the building they'd been offered by the city for driving out Blue Skull, but it was finally done, and now the fruits of their hard work were laid before her eyes. Sure, they needed more tables and chairs, and the bar was unstocked, and they needed to get some lacrima in here for the lights if they wanted to stay past sundown, but it was unequivocally hers. Well, hers and Zera's, and Yuri's, and Warod's, and Prech's, but still, this was all her idea, her dream given life around her. Plus, since it was her idea, that meant that she got to be master. Master Mavis Vermilion, chaser of fairies, user of fairy magic, and first master of the guild called Fairy Tail. Yeah, she liked the sound of that. She did notice something else missing, besides all of the regular amenities one would find in your average guild. Naruto still had not arrived. But she could rectify that. She reached into the top of her dress before fishing out the special kunai Naruto gifted her. The ex-treasure hunters looked confused and a bit worried at the fact that the bright girl that they'd come to know in the past few weeks made a habit of keeping an extremely sharp knife beneath her shirt. They'd never seen it before, so they could only assume that she was either gifted at hiding it among the rest of her things, or she hadn't taken it off once in the month since they'd met. If she found no reason to use it while fighting for their lives against both Blue Skull and a possessed Yuri wreaking havoc as an enormous dragon skeleton, then what possible reason could she have for bringing it out now, when things had finally become peaceful? The blonde girl seemed a strange mixture of worried and excited as she paced to the most open part of the guild floor. Turning back to face her friends, the worry disappeared and she sent them all a beaming smile. "Yuri, Prect, Warod, would you like to see something amazing?" she asked with a mischievous gleam in her eye. The three men glanced at each other warily before turning to Zera with a questioning look on their faces. Zera just shook her head with a smile and pointed back to Mavis. "Just let her express her inner showman. We've never gotten to be on this end before. Even I'm kind of looking forward to it." Her cryptic words only seemed to confuse her elders even further. Her smile widened, but when she turned back to look at Mavis, the smile immediately fell from her face. The reason was because Mavis was standing there casually, one hand on her hip and the other spinning the kunai around one finger by the ring, like she'd seen Naruto do so many times before. "Mavis," she yelled, hands on her hips and a scolding frown on her face. "How many times have Naruto and I told you not to do that? You'll poke your eye out." Mavis stopped spinning the knife and began to sulk. "But Naruto does it all the time," she whined. "It makes him look so cool. I wanna look that cool." But Zera was having none of it. "Naruto has years of practice playing with ultra-sharp and dangerous knives. You, on the other hand, have no such experience," she scolded. She heard a grumbled "and whose fault is that?" and sighed, relenting a little. "If you can find a totally blunt kunai to practice with, I suppose you could go ahead and try. If you're going to do it anyway, you might as well be safe about it." Mavis immediately brightened and rushed over to her friend, engulfing her in a hug, careful not to stab Sitra in the back with the blade. "Thank you," she cried. "You're the best." She let go of her friend and spun around a few times in some strange facsimile of a dance before snapping back to reality and facing the exasperated group in front of her. Clearing her throat, she addressed them. "As I was saying before, do you three want to see something amazing?" By this point the three older men just wanted the girl to calm down. They had never seen her this excited about something before. Deciding that going along with whatever the girl was spouting would calm her quicker than anything else, they responded affirmatively. "Yeah. Sure. Why not? If you insist." Waving her arms in a come-hither motion, she beckoned the men and Sitra to form a loose semicircle with herself in the middle. Sharing an excited look with her best friend, she spoke to the others with a small smirk on her face. She couldn't wait to see their reactions. "Watch," she said, pulling her arm back, "and be amazed." She threw the kunai with all her might and it soared through the air for about 6 feet before embedding itself into the wooden floor with a thunk. All was silent for a few moments before Yuri opted to speak. "Samfit waskul. Good Uthro." Mavis just brushed him off. "Just wait. He'll come any moment now. Just keep watching." She stared intently at the kunai, not moving a muscle, not even daring to blink lest she miss his arrival. This brought everyone's attention back to the seemingly innocuous knife sticking out of the newly replaced floorboards. Behind them, the door to the guild opened, admitting a single person before it closed again, and silence reigned. The new arrival observed them for a moment and then decided to speak. "What are you all doing?" He was genuinely curious. Their clustered bodies blocked any view of what it was they were staring so intently at. "We're waiting for our friend to appear. He should be here by now," she told the man. The traveler raised his eyebrow at that declaration. Why would they be staring at a floor if they were waiting for someone to show up? Wouldn't it be more logical to watch the door? He took a few steps forward to look over the blonde girl's shoulder at the subject of their interest. Ah, that made sense then. He thought he'd felt it just a few moments ago, though he ignored it because he was already so close. He considered informing them of his arrival, but the whole situation was just too wonderful to ruin, so instead, they settled back down to watch the knife. Nearly 15 seconds passed before Zara's curiosity got the better of her and she decided to see who had decided to venture into their guild. What she saw made her feel extremely foolish and a tad bit disappointed. She'd really wanted to see the looks on the treasure hunters' faces. Oh well, she'd just have to settle for Mavis. "Naruto?" she shouted in surprise. "I know. What could be taking him so long? He said he'd come as soon as it was thrown, so why isn't he here yet?" Mavis looked confused at her fellow blonde's lack of appearance. "Maybe he knows you're not in any danger, so he's ignoring what's obviously an attempt to impress some new friends," Naruto hypothesized. By this point, Mavis was the only one left staring at the kunai embedded in the floorboards. Zara had both hands over her mouth, trying to stifle her giggles, while the three treasure hunters shared an amused glance, having figured out the newest arrival's identity. "Or maybe," he added, "he was already nearby when you threw it and decided to take the long way here." Mavis hummed in thought. "That's possible I suppose, but if he really was that close, then he should have been here already, and the only ones here are." She cut herself off as the realization finally struck. Spinning around, she flung herself into the older blonde's arms with a happy cry. "Naruto? You're here." Her beaming smile suddenly morphed into a frown. "Where were you? You were supposed to flash in and wow our new friends. Zara and I really wanted to see their faces, and you just had to go and ruin it, didn't you?" She looked up at Naruto with narrowed eyes and hands in hips waiting for his response. The shinobi simply stared back, unperturbed by Mavis's rapid-fire speech. "I was already in town when you threw the kunai, so I decided to just walk here. I wanted to talk to the townspeople and get an idea of what was going on before I came to meet you guys. This whole town looks like a bomb went off." He turned to address the group as a whole at this point. "The stuff I heard in town was sorta far-fetched, so if you don't mind, can someone explain exactly what happened?" He turned back to Mavis and Zara as he added, "And would either of you care to explain why you went traipsing around the mainland with a group of strange men without telling me first?" Naruto tried to look and sound disappointed and reproachful, but with his youthful voice and appearance, he came out looking more petulant and betrayed. "Isn't everyone a strange man when you're a 13-year-old girl?" Zara asked, looking highly amused at Naruto's sudden bout of overprotectiveness. "And besides, these three are completely harmless," she added, smirking toward the treasure hunters. All three young men took offense to that comment and Yuri made to reply, but was cut off by Mavis. Eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears, she clasped her hands in front of her in a pleading manner before gazing up at Naruto and speaking in her best puppy dog voice. "We're really sorry, Naruto. I was gonna use the kunai, but you said it was for emergencies only, and I knew Zara and I could handle ourselves if something did go wrong, and I didn't want to interrupt you in case you were doing something super important like saving the world, and you're always saying that we should go out and explore the world, so I thought it would be alright, and I really hope you're not mad at us, because if you were, I'd be so sad, and I wouldn't know what to do if you weren't my friend anymore, so please, please, please say you'll forgive us. Finished with her spiel, Mavis held her pleading pose but stood gasping for breath as she continued her impromptu staring contest with the blonde man in front of her. The treasure hunters looked at the gasping girl with pity. The cloaked man facing the group looked like serious business. He looked young, but they could tell from his eyes that this guy had seen things. Things that no one that young should see. This was the kind of man who doled out harsh punishments to those who broke the rules. Just how harsh remained to be seen though, so they stood with bated breath, ready to intervene on behalf of their young friend, should whatever the blonde man choose to do be too extreme for such a young and innocent girl. Naruto finally moved and the three treasure hunters tensed, but instead of the vicious scolding or possibly even physical violence they were expecting, the large blonde man dropped to his knees in front of Mavis before throwing his arms wide and engulfing the girl in a massive bear hug. Tears streaming down his face in rivers while he blubbered semi-incoherently about not being able to stay mad at such sweet and innocent little girls. Shaking off her moment of surprise at her ploy actually working, Mavis patted the wailing man-child on his head a few times and then looked back over her shoulder at the rest of the room. She failed to hold back a giggle at the sight that awaited her. Her three newest friends were slumped over, mouths agape and eyes wide at the completely unexpected turn of events, while Zara stood a few feet to their left, massaging her forehead with one hand and trying her best to hold in an exasperated sigh at Naruto's extreme overreaction. This scene was an almost exact replica of one that had occurred a few months ago, after Naruto had scolded the two of them for trying to snoop in his belongings. All they had done was cracked mildly rebuked expressions, and he had almost instantly proclaimed how sorry he was for being too harsh on them. Mavis had found it to be part of the ancient man's charm, but personally, Zara suspected that hundreds of years devoid of genuine human interaction and companionship had left the shinobi a bit cracked in the head. Of course, she wouldn't say that to his face for fear of drowning in the subsequent torrent of tears. It took a good 5 minutes to get Naruto's manic sobbing under control, but when he did stop, his transition back into a cool and composed figure of authority was frighteningly abrupt. Back in control of himself, he faced the group with a serious expression on his youthful face. "Alright Mavis, Zara, I'm sorry for my reaction. I was out of line. I'm not your father and I have no say in what you do with your lives," he began, "but, as your friend, I would have appreciated a more timely warning when you decide to go gallivanting off with three strangers who you knew little to nothing about." Both girls looked properly mollified and nodded at Naruto's reasoning. It was unfair of them to leave Tenryjima without properly notifying Naruto first. He was the closest thing they had to a guardian since Red Lizard's annihilation 7 years previous. Naruto, seeing their expressions and deciding they had learned their lesson, gave them a soft smile and decided to move on. "So, how about this? I don't know about you all, but I'm starving. How about we go find ourselves some lunch so I can get to know your three new friends here and you can fill me in as to what you've all been doing these past 3 weeks. Sound good?" When he received a round of nods in reply, he spun on his heels and strolled back to the door of the guild. Pausing mid-stride, he threw a look over his shoulder and asked, "Is there any place to actually get food around here? The town's sort of a mess. It looks like a dragon came rampaging through here." Noticing a collective wince from the group of 5 behind him, he heaved a weary sigh. He was getting too old for this shit. So this is crazy fucking late. Sorry about that. I had about a third of this written 2 days after I posted the first chapter, but school, sickness, and my laptop catching fire faster than Katniss Everdeen put the rest of this on hold. I had to write most of this, including this on my iPad, so please excuse any spelling or grammar errors. I'll look this back over when I get my laptop fixed and hopefully correct any mistakes. I don't especially like this chapter, but it's gonna have to do for now. I still have no clue what direction this story is going, but there will probably be a few chapters of post-Mavis pre-canon Naruto traveling around before returning to Fairy Tail, just to add a little bit of originality to this story. Finally, it's finals week and I've got 3 more exams before I'm done with school, so I'm not sure when I'll get the next chapter out. Hopefully quicker than this one. I really appreciate all the nice things y'all have had to say about this story so far, so thanks for that. Hope y'all enjoyed. The group of 6 soon found themselves sitting in one of the few remaining cafes left standing after Magnolia's near total destruction. Once they got settled and placed their orders, Naruto turned a stern look on the rest of the group. "So start talking. I'm pretty sure I came through here a few years ago, and the town certainly didn't look like this. Start from the beginning though, with those threes," he gestured to the treasure hunters, "arrival on the island, and why it is you took off without telling me." His frown made the two young girls look down in shame, but they schooled their expressions and began taking turns to tell the tale of their journey from Tenrajima to Magnolia. Naruto's face remained expressionless throughout their story, not wavering in the slightest. And so, to stop Yuri from destroying the town and killing anyone, I used the magic we were taught to disable him without hurting him. Mavis said with a smile. Naruto considered this for a moment before turning to the girl. What kind of magic allowed you to subdue a rampaging dragon skeleton so easily? Mavis giggled and clapped her hands together excitedly. It's this amazing lost magic called law. If she was expecting Naruto to be wowed by her knowledge of such an advanced form of magic, she was sorely disappointed. Instead, those at the table noticed his entire body tense and his face twisting to look like he had just swallowed something extremely sour. Naruto had only encountered the magic of law twice in his overlong existence, and neither occasion was one he would likely forget. The first was before the advent of the guild system, when mages roamed around the country, taking work wherever they could find it. Oftentimes, the weaker mages would band together under a stronger, more experienced mage for protection, much like the guilds that existed today. However, instead of basing themselves out of a single city, they would wander in large groups across the country to wherever the work was most plentiful. One of these groups had, instead of taking the rather low-paying jobs offered by civilians looking for a helping hand, started attacking small settlements along the Seven Fiori border, taking anything that suited their fancy and leaving the towns a mere husk of their former selves. While the majority of the mages making up the troop were rather insignificant in terms of magical ability, their leader was something else entirely. The twisted man had at some time in his travels stumbled across the secrets of law and perverted them to suit his needs. If whatever poor town he and his gang arrived in didn't acquiesce to their every whim, the leader would work his magic and every life in the village, bar his own followers, would be snuffed out instantly. The group would then take what they desired and move along to their next victims, leaving the streets full of pale cooling bodies behind them. His group of murderers and bandits continued like this through 8 small villages and towns before Naruto stumbled upon their handiwork and tracked them to a large trading outpost straddling the borders of Fiori, Bosco, and Seven. Once he identified the leader, not hard considering the ridiculous amount of fine jewelry that adorned his body, as well as the gleaming crown situated atop his head, he had no qualms about sneaking into the tavern the group had acquired for the night and ending the man's life as he slept. At another point in time, Naruto would have tried to convince him of the error of his ways, but he had been around far too long to not fully realize that there would always those for whom human life held no meaning. If these kinds of people were left to their own devices, they would continue to murder and steal to their heart's content. With the death of their most powerful ally, the group of men quickly parted ways in search of new associates to keep them safe. But it wasn't this encounter with the terrifying magic of law that made him so weary of the fact that Mavis had learned it. Naruto knew that she was a kind soul and would never use the power her magic granted her to do anything but protect those she held dear. No, the uneasy feeling settling in his stomach came from his second, most recent encounter with the ancient spell. The event itself was extremely brief, but it only served to drive home the fact that certain lost magics were lost for a reason, that being that they were very, very dangerous to attempt if not fully mastered. The second practitioner of law that Naruto had the misfortune to meet had been ambushing travelers and traders on one of the main roads between the peninsula of Sin and the Pergrant Kingdom. Naruto had been on his way to enjoy some nice wholesome relaxation on the lovely beaches of Sin when the group of bandits took the seemingly young man traveling by himself as an easy target and leapt out from their hiding spots to attack him. Without breaking his stride, the immortal grabbed his closest attacker's sloppy punch out of the air and proceeded to swing the man around like a bullwhip, sending his flailing legs and feet into the faces of the man-turned-weapons comrades. Tossing the heaving man aside lest he get his favorite read-only cloak dirty, Naruto turned a raised eyebrow the only man left standing, the apparent leader of the ragtag group. The man sputtered before stumbling back a few steps and taking a fighting stance. He then proceeded to throw leaves of all things at the one-time leaf ninja. It quickly became obvious to the bandit that such mundane attacks would be ineffectual against the blonde who continued his leisurely stroll toward his attacker, while using the smallest of movements to twist his body out of the path of what looked to Naruto to be extremely sharp leaves. In response to this, the bandit took a few more hasty steps back before looking up, staring over the blonde's shoulder, and smirking victoriously. Confused at his attacker's sudden shift in demeanor, Naruto threw a glance behind him to see if there was something he'd missed in the previous attack. Seeing nothing of interest, he shrugged before turning back to face his would-be mugger. What he saw, though, made him stumble for the first time since the group of men jumped from the bushes nearly 1 minute earlier. Clasped between the man's outstretched hands was a compact, brightly glowing orb of pure light. Momentarily astounded that the mediocre mage in front of him was knowledgeable of such an esoteric and powerful spell, Naruto paused in wonder at the strangeness of it all. Capitalizing on his victim's distraction, the bandit moved to clap his hands together and end the blonde man's life. The bandit's movement snapped Naruto out of his internal musings, and he cursed himself for being distracted so easily. He kicked off toward the mage at blistering speeds, fist poised to blast the man into unconsciousness. He knew almost instantly that it would be a futile effort. The bandit's hands were moving closer and closer together and would touch instants before Naruto could reach him. He braced himself for what would come next. He wasn't quite sure what actually happened, but it surely would not be pleasant. Even after all this time, after all of the research he had done into his immortality, if that was even what this was, he was unsure as to whether or not his presence here was truly permanent or if it could be snuffed out by something or someone powerful enough. At this point in his life, he wasn't afraid of death. The looming threat of time taking its toll on one's body withered away after the first 2 centuries or so. No, he was much more worried about what would happen if this didn't kill him. As far as he had seen, the magic of law left no physical indications of damage on the body. It was as if their souls simply got up and left, leaving their bodies to just drop to the ground where they had stood. If this magic of law truly did attack one's soul, then what would happen to him? Any physical damage he had ever sustained had been dealt with as a non-issue. He'd been beaten, stabbed, cut up, blown up, and just altogether fucked up, but none of that could damage something as ethereal as his soul, which as far as he could tell, refused to leave his body. But what would happen when something came along and tried to force his soul from his body? Would it give up and depart without a fight? Stand tall and weather the influx of magic without issue? Or would it fight and fight to stay housed within him while law swept in and tore it apart piece by piece until all that was left was a mere shadow of what once was? No, Naruto was not afraid of death at this point, but he was absolutely terrified of being condemned to a half-life for all eternity, being unable to think, to act, to feel like he once did. And so, as he closed his eyes in that final instant, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. That if he did die here, soul extinguished and heart stopped, he dearly, truly hoped that his corpse had built up enough momentum to break this asshole's face in when they connected. But as bright light flashed in front of him, things did not simply stop. The wind was still rushing past his ears, his muscles and eyelids were still clenched impossibly tight, and he was still cognizant enough to realize these facts. And all at once, the sound of the wind was replaced by an ice-meaty thwack as Naruto's fist connected with the bandit's face. He allowed himself a moment to enjoy the satisfying feeling that accompanied the sound before he realized there was something missing. There should have been a large crunch to go along with the thwack as his fist broke the asshole's nose. And now that he thought about it, the thwack hadn't sounded like it normally should. It was a bit too wet. And speaking of wet, the blood dripping from his fist was the wrong consistency. It lacked the sticky, slimy feeling of snot ejected from the shattered sinus cavities, mixed in with the thick but runny this in only a second. Naruto opened his eyes to discover what was causing all of these anomalies. The sight that met him was one that he had honestly never seen before, even in more than 7 centuries of life. It sickened him almost as much as it amazed and intrigued him. Because as many times as he had heard someone threaten to turn their enemy, usually Naruto himself, inside out, he had never actually seen someone follow up on that threat. It was certainly an eye-opener for the immortal. Muscles and organs lay exposed in the open air, flecked with dirt from his trip across the ground courtesy of Naruto's fist. His head, which moments ago had been topped with shaggy brown hair, was now covered by a nearly uniform layer of pink, fleshy. His eyes remained unaltered bar the disappearance of eyelids, and his nose had been inverted to where all that remained was a thumb-sized hole that Naruto assumed was the man's nasal passage. Below that hole sat another, larger hole, ringed with yellow teeth jutting out at every possible angle. Inside his mouth, Naruto could see the coarse and wiry strands of the man's untrimmed beard, bunching up with the excess skin of his neck and slowly restricting his airways. The immortal's eyes traveled down until they rested on the bandit's still beating heart, dangling listlessly off the side of his chest. Lungs stutteringly inflated as the man drew harsh painful breaths. Intestines spilled on either side of him, a few still sliding away, giving the appearance of a writhing mass of gelatinous slugs. It was a horrible and grisly sight, and had Naruto been anyone else, he would have thrown up every last thing in his stomach until gnawed, but bile remained. As it was, he took a few moments to observe the slowly dying man, imprinting this sight into his memory as a reminder not to trifle with what you don't understand. Slowly he pulled a gleaming silver kunai from under his cloak and knelt down next to what only moments ago had been a hale and hearty if slightly haggard man. No one deserved to suffer like this. Well, Naruto could think of a couple people, but as this man was neither an egocentric sociopath nor a psychotic goddess intent on killing every last soul on the planet, Naruto would do him a kindness and put him out of his misery. As he brought the kunai to hover over the man's head, the inverted bandit took one last rasping breath. As the knife began its descent, the man attempted to utter out one last word. Naruto. Hello? Naruto? Are you in there? Naruto snapped out of his memories with a sharp shake of his head and glanced up to see Mavis standing before him waving her hand in front of his suddenly pale face. He was out of his seat in a literal flash, grasping Mavis under her arms and lifting her until her head was even with his own. His eyes roved over her petite body, searching for anything out of place on her frame. When he couldn't find anything wrong, he relaxed for a moment, letting his shoulders unbunch and his arms drop down a bit. Suddenly he tensed again and lifted Mavis up, higher than before, bringing her directly over him, before tilting his head and looking up the skirt of her dress. For a moment all was silent. Zara palmed her face in embarrassment, while the three treasure hunters looked on wonderingly, trying to puzzle out how the cloaked blonde managed to walk while lugging around such an enormous pair of big brass balls. Passerbys looked on scornfully as the obviously a pedophile so brazenly looked up the young girl's skirt. Mavis's mouth dropped into a surprised "oh" for a moment before her face flushed brighter than anyone had thought possible. Once her flush had reached its peak, it was only a moment before she screamed. "Aye." Kicking her feet out, Mavis made contact with Naruto's nose, snapping it with a resounding crack. As his head shot back, blood and mucus spewing forth from his nose, his grip loosened enough for Mavis to wriggle free and drop none too gracefully to the ground. "What did you do that for?" Mavis yelled, face still retaining its glowing blush. "What you mean, what was that for? What was that for?" Naruto hollered back, gesturing wildly to his broken nose. Mavis huffed, crossing her arms, looking none too pleased with the ancient man's obliviousness. "You went peeking up my dress. I'm not ready to take that step yet. We haven't even had our first date." It took a moment for her words to register in her own ears, and the blush that had been fading steadily returned with a vengeance. Naruto stared at her in confusion until it hit him, and then his face changed to one of extreme embarrassment as he began to stutter out some form of response to the younger blonde's declaration. "You're wealth at some age when you're older and have, grown up a bit," he half said, half questioned. Centuries of trial and error and he was still an awkward mess when it came to discussing relationships. That brought the rest of the small group, who had been snickering quietly amongst themselves, up short. Their joyful and amused faces instantly morphed into those of worry and sadness. As one, they turned to Mavis, whose head was bowed, dripping bangs shadowing her eyes from the others. Naruto's expression shifted from awkward embarrassment to worry in a blink, and a mask of seriousness slipped back over his features. "What is it? Did something happen?" He paused to think for a moment. "Something went wrong when you cast law, didn't it?" That brought Mavis's head snapping up. Her slightly watery eyes searched Naruto's, looking for answers that he didn't have. "You know about law?" she asked, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe he knew of some way to fix her, to make her normal. She thought that she had gotten over it, accepted that she would stay a prepubescent girl for the rest of her life, but seeing Naruto again brought home the fact that she would never have a chance with him now. Her far-off and completely improbable dreams of marriage and a family with Naruto, her hell, with anybody were gone, crushed by the fact that she would never age to maturity, never be able to bear children, be forever looked down upon as naught but a silly little girl. Naruto's voice interrupted her introspection, but she missed what he said. "Come again?" "I said I do," Naruto repeated. "I've met two people before who used law. The second one I met, I don't know where he learned it, but when he tried to use it, he washered. Badly. But since you're still standing here talking to me, you obviously got off better than he did. So why don't you tell me what happened and I'll do anything within my power to help make it better." He finished with a comforting smile, only slightly hindered by the fact that dried blood still covered most of the bottom of his face, as well as his neck and parts of his cloak. Mavis noticed absently that he must have reset his nose at some point in the conversation, as apart from the blood it looked good as new. "When I used law to stop Yuri after he got possessed by the Tenru Jade," she saw Yuri grimace out of the corner of her eye, but continued on. "I knew I couldn't use it perfectly, but I thought I had enough control over it to keep it from hurting anybody." Her frown deepened. "I guess I was wrong. After I cast the spell, my body got really hot. It felt like I was burning up from the inside, and right when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the heat went away and there was this flash of freezing cold. It was the coldest thing I've ever felt, like everything inside of me was turning to ice. Don't really remember anything after that. When I woke up, the doctors told me that I'll never age beyond the point that I am now. That no matter how old I get, I'll look like this for the rest of my life." She let out a single choked sob as she finished her story, before standing up straight and forcing a smile to the surface. "But that's okay," she said with as much brightness as she could muster. "If this is the price I have to pay to help my friends, then that's perfectly fine. If I had to, I would do it all over again, because if my friends can't rely on me to help when they need it, how can I rely on them?" Naruto gave her a bright smile. "That's a great sentiment to have. You remind me a lot of myself when I was young," he said warmly. "And about the whole not aging thing, well, it's certainly not the worst thing that could happen," he continued, optimism ringing clear in his voice. I've never had someone else not age with me before. Well, at least not someone that I spend a lot of time with. It'll be a novel experience. Mavis, spirits buoyed, crossed over to where Naruto still sat on the ground and embraced him in a tight hug, whispering her thanks in his ear. When she let go, she paused for a moment before remembering how they had gotten started on this conversation in the first place. So why did you see fit to go peeking up my dress? She asked, one half curiosity, one half righteous indignation. Naruto chuckled a bit, scratching the back of his head. Inside he was sweating, trying desperately to remember his thought process that brought him to think looking up a 12-year-old's dress was a good idea. Well, you see, remember that other guy that I mentioned who used law? Mavis nodded in confirmation. Yeah, well, he sort of turned himself into the attendee. He finished in a rush. The quintet of non-ninja tried to clean out their ears in an attempt to understand just what had been said. Precht spoke up for the whole group after a moment. Could you repeat that? I think we misheard you. Naruto jerked and looked over at the table, seemingly having forgotten that he and Mavis were not alone in this discussion. Naruto swallowed and repeated his last sentence, this time slower. I said that the last guy I saw use law turned himself inside out after using it to try to kill me. The rest of the group's eyes widened and jaws dropped. Warod was the first to recover. When you say inside out, you mean like he trailed off, gesturing vaguely, having no idea how to phrase his question. Yeah, like, organs flopping around like fish, muscles and fat on the outside, skin and hair on the inside. He explained with a grimace. The group was once again silent for a few moments before Yuri summed up all of their thoughts. Holy shit. He breathed. You mean that could have happened to Mavis? Naruto nodded solemnly and Mavis gulped. She was really beginning to regret her chosen field of magic. Now that she thought about it, staying cute, cuddly, and sweet for the rest of her days didn't seem so bad. Standing up and brushing off his cloak, Naruto and Mavis returned to their seats at the table and made an effort to change the subject. So, Naruto said, looking at the three treasure hunters across from him with a bright smile on his still bloodied face. Who are you and why shouldn't I kill you for taking these two, he said, pointing at Mavis and Zara, away from their home, on a dangerous adventure, without telling me first. Precht choked on his food and Yuri spat out his drink while Warod clapped both of them on the back to abate their sudden coughing fits. All three were looking surprised and a bit fearful at the smiling blonde man. Well, at least until Zara and Mavis both took it upon themselves to rein in the slightly deranged ninja by slapping him, not without some force, on the back of his head. Naruto. Zara exclaimed sharply, reproach heavy in her voice. You can't go around threatening to kill our friends just because you feel left out. Naruto hung his smarting head, a frown on his face. Who said it was a threat? He mumbled childishly. Zara and Mavis were his first close friends in more than 3 centuries. Was it so bad to make sure that these two sweet girls didn't get hurt in any way? It was obvious to him that he needed to take a more active role in their lives if he wanted to protect them. They'd been safe enough on Tenryjima, cut off from the evils of the world. But now that they had experienced the real world and all of the wonders it held, there was no way they would want to return to boring old Tenru. No, they would fight tooth and nail to stay here no matter what he said or did. As it was, he might as well make nice with their new friends. It couldn't hurt to have a few guy friends for the first time in a long while. He sighed. He was getting too soft. Sorry, it's been a while since I've had to actually talk to people and I'm still getting used to it. I'm Naruto. He said, nodding his head and giving the three men an apologetic smile. Warod recovered first and extended his hand across the table to the shinobi. Warod Sequin. Pleasure to meet you, Naruto. Giving the blonde a firm handshake, he sat back and waited for his friends to introduce themselves. Precht was next, giving the shinobi an appraising look as he offered his hand to shake. Precht Giebelg. He said as they shook hands, not offering anything else. Finally, Yuri introduced himself. Yuri Dreyer, King of Awesome. He exclaimed with a cheeky grin. Naruto leaned back in his chair with a curious look on his face. So this guy that taught you all magic. Did you manage to get his name? Seems really irresponsible to teach a 12-year-old something as powerful and dangerous as law and not even explain what could go wrong with it. This had been bothering him since Mavis and Zara had reached this part in their story. They were extremely vague when it came to describing their time in the forest learning their respective magics. One thing they had been clear on was that it was a single person who taught all of them. One man who was talented and knowledgeable enough to teach 5 people 5 completely different types of magic, including one as powerful as law. Naruto liked to think he knew of any mage worth hearing about anywhere this side of Bellum, and the people he could think of who would be able to accomplish this made up a very short list. A very short list of people that he dearly hoped had not gotten that close to Zara and Mavis without him even knowing about it. He looked up at the 5 of them expectantly, awaiting an answer. Mavis looked thoughtful for a moment before shrugging. You know, I don't think I actually ever caught his name. She looked around at her friends. Did any of you? When all of them either shrugged or shook their heads in the negative, she furrowed her eyebrows and struck a thinking pose. Well, he was sort of skinny. He had black hair that sort of stuck out at the top. She demonstrated this by sticking her hand atop her head and wiggling her fingers. He had a black coat and a white shawl draped across his shoulder. Oh. And he had this really terrible magic that killed everything he touched. She finished with a smile. Naruto stared at her wide-eyed, hoping that he'd misheard. Because the man she just described was number one on the list of people I don't want within 100 kilometers of Mavis and Zeref Dragneel. AKA the Black Mage Zeref. Shit. Naruto was not happy. Part of his self-imposed mission as an immortal wanderer was, as of about 300 years ago, to keep tabs on Zeref and if he could, rein the boy in when he became unstable. The fact that Zeref was in Fiori was unwelcome news indeed, considering that the last Naruto had heard, he was moping around somewhere in the east of the Pergrant Kingdom. That's a long fucking way from Southeast Fiori. Someone, somewhere in his information network was going to get a stern talking to. It wasn't even that Naruto hated Zeref. In fact, 80% of the time, he was a kind and gentle soul. He was one of the few people Naruto could relate to anymore, being immortal himself, and sometimes, when either one was feeling a bit personable, they would seek the other out for a few weeks of human interaction before they both retreated into seclusion. But the other 20% of the time, when Zeref lost his shit and decided that the human race was in need of some cleansing. Well, those were the times that the shinobi truly dreaded. Because Zeref didn't do things in half measures. If Zeref wanted to kill shit, he would well and truly kill shit. Trying to fight Zeref, whose magic's only purpose was to kill everything, was hard enough, but doing it while also trying to contain the walking natural disasters that he birthed from nothing and keep them from killing everything in sight was just too much for one man to handle. Luckily, he had only needed to do so 3 times in the last 300 or so years. A few months, once every century, dedicated to creating sentient weapons of mass destruction and parading them around Earthland for some indiscriminate killing, wasn't nearly as bad as it could be. Hell, Naruto could hardly even blame the kid. He'd felt the urge once or twice to just snap and kill everything in sight. Living for hundreds and hundreds of years with very little extended human contact could be a little taxing on the mind. The good news about all of this was that, if the pattern held true, Zeref should be calm, cool, and collected for another 70 or 80 years at least. That was brilliant news because it meant that he wouldn't be a danger to Mavis and Zera because they would most likely already be dead by then. Thank goodness for small miracles. Shit. That was kinda morbid. Shaking his head vigorously to abandon that train of thought, his eyes regained focus and he saw the 5 novice wizards giving him a queer look. So do you know who he is then, Naruto? Mavis asked. She would really like to know who she could thank for helping her save her friends and all of Magnolia with the magic he taught them. Naruto frowned. Yeah, his name's Zeref. He heard gasps from around the table. I take it you've heard of him then? Precht regained his voice first. Yes. The Black Mage Zeref. One of the most evil wizards of all time. It said that he created countless horrors. Demons that could wipe out entire settlements with a single spell. But he was born centuries ago, there's no way that he could have been the one to teach us. The boy who taught us couldn't have been much older than us. In fact, he may have been younger. Naruto shook his head once more. No, if he was as Mavis described, then it was definitely Zeref. He's one of the few people I can think of who would be knowledgeable enough to teach you all such varied magics. And of those few, he's the only I can think of who'd be wandering around the forests of Fiori. The rest hold important positions in various governments and wouldn't have time to go on a walkabout through the forest. Precht looked a bit put out at being contradicted and asked haughtily, what is it that makes you such an expert on a long-dead dark mage? You're what, 20? 21? Naruto glanced over at Mavis and Zera, surprised that they had yet to mention his immortality. Zera caught his look and turned to the 3 treasure hunters. Naruto looks young for his age. At this, Mavis snorted. Like really young. That seemed to grab their attention. Precht and Warad had appraising looks on their faces as they considered this. Yuri just looked confused. So you're what? Like 30? 35? Naruto shot Yuri an amused smirk. No, not exactly. Suffice to say, that to me, Zeref is just getting out of his diapers. Warad spoke up next, so just how old are you? The way you're talking, it's like you're hundreds of years old. But that's impossible. Ah, but you see, it is very possible. Naruto paused. At least, I'm pretty sure it's possible. I don't think I've dreamt up the last few centuries. But then again, it has happened before. The last time I ran into Metallicana, he punched me through 2 mountains. I was unconscious for about a week. I had some of the most vivid dreams. In one of them I was swimming in Ramen Ocean and the Ramades came up from their homes at the bottom to serenade me while they fed and he cut himself off with a blush and cleared his throat. Anyway, I'm sure that Zeref was the one who taught you because he's a friend of mine. The others looked at him in disbelief and a bit of worry. Well, sort of. Sometimes. When he's not massacring hundreds of innocent people and or bowling his eyes out at least. All 5 of his companions had bemused looks upon their faces, and Naruto decided it was time to, once again, change the subject. So, what are you gonna do now? He was mostly directing this question at Mavis and Zara, but figured he should include the treasure hunters as well. Mavis responded for all of them. We're going to run the guild, of course. The matter-of-fact way in which she answered threw him for a loop. Huh? Eloquent as always. Fairy tale. Mavis answered, yet again in that tone that said she expected him to already know this. Fairy tale? What's that? Naruto queried. He was still completely lost. No, fairy tale. She corrected him as if speaking to someone who wasn't exactly all there in the head, which she very well could have been. Okay, fairy tale. He repeated, emphasizing the last word for whatever reason. I still don't know what that is. Mavis shot him a long-suffering look. I've already told you, it's our guild. Since when do we have a guild? He questioned, honestly curious. Had he forgotten something that important? Where was his guild mark? Was it somewhere under his clothing? He hoped it was on his ass. That would be hilarious. Since next week when the paperwork gets back from the council. Oh. That still didn't make any sense to him, but before he could respond, Zara, growing tired of the back and forth, cut in. What Mavis means is that after we ran Blue Skull out of town, she decided that Magnolia needed a new guild to step in and protect the town, so that something like this, she gestured around her at the destruction, would never happen again. So we created a guild, fairy tale. Mavis is going to be the first master. The building that you found us in is going to be the guild hall. They just got done fixing it up earlier this morning. Naruto finally understood, and he was actually impressed. It wasn't a bad idea. A guild would not only protect Magnolia, but it would protect Mavis and Zara as well. Mages would flock to a new guild, and once they joined, they would do their best to protect their fellow guildmates and master. This was perfect. The girls were heroes here. The townspeople would treat them well and help with whatever problems they had that were too small to get him involved. They would be stationary, so he would still know where to find them if the need should arise. Yes, he decided. This would work out just fine. So where do I sign up? Mavis beamed. Naruto stared blankly down at his blood-soaked hands, watching idly as the crimson fluid dripped languidly to the floor. Around him, dozens of bodies lay dead, splayed in awkward angles around the room. Dozens more were still breathing, though most struggled to do so. Without aid, the last would be dead in a few hours at most. It was easy to tell with a glance that these men had not died painlessly. If the looks of horror and pure agony on the faces of the dead were not enough, the torn, burned, and eviscerated bodies, some of which lacked aforementioned head, made it extremely obvious. Naruto kept his face expressionless as he turned to make his way to the door. On his way, he stepped callously on a man's kidney that had found its way to the floor via the gaping hole in his abdomen. The man let out a wailing scream as his body stiffened and shook from the horrendous pain. His scream was cut short, and he let out one last rasping breath as his heart finally expired and his eyes glassed over. The bloodied shinobi paid him no mind and continued to the door of the guild. Stepping outside, he absently noted hot sun shining down on the clearing that the guild hall resided in. Such a bright and beautiful day was a complete contrast to the massacre inside the building. Naruto kept walking away from the guild until he was around 50 meters away. Turning, he regarded the sight of all the bloodshed one last time before inhaling sharply through his nose. Pain. Gakumakyaku no Jutsu. Bringing a slightly closed fist in front of his mouth, the blonde exhaled, releasing a thin stream of white-hot flames from the end of his hand. The flames continued in a compact beam for about 20 meters before they suddenly exploded outwards to encompass the entire width of the clearing, more than 100 meters at its widest point. The wooden guild hall was quickly set ablaze, and the quiet of the forest was shattered by the agonized screams of the still-living guild members trapped inside. Within the guild crematorium, hair and clothes were incinerated, flesh melted from bone, and blood boiled in veins. This continued for nearly 2 minutes before the last of the screams finally died out. Naruto, still yet to show any trace of emotion on his face, observed the burning and collapsing wreckage of the guild in silence. When he was unable to hear the anguished cries of his victims, he sighed and turned his head to see the rest of the damage he'd wrought. For as far back as he could see into the woods from this vantage point, flora and fauna were being turned to ash before his eyes. Deciding to stop the forest fire before it got too out of control, a cage Bunshin appeared next to him with a thought. Stepping onto the clone's already interlocked hands, he bent his leg and pushed as the clone heaved its creator up into the sky. From this new position, Naruto could see that the flames continued for nearly a kilometer past the raised guild hall. Once more, he inhaled deeply and proceeded to look straight down at the still smoldering guild. Suiton. Daibakusui Shauha. Taking a moment to build and shape the chakra within him, he released an almighty torrent of water from his gut. Millions of gallons of water poured down with crushing force, flattening everything it came into contact with. The massive deluge continued to pour forth from Naruto's mouth for half a minute until the water line had reached above the highest of the burning trees. Employing the control gained from centuries of practice, the blonde shaped the mass of water into an enormous sphere that was easily visible from the closest town, nearly 20 kilometers away. Landing atop and looking down into his makeshift aquarium, Naruto was just able to make out the last few pieces of the guild. Several charred planks, a splintered table, and what looked to be half of a human skull. It wasn't enough. There could be nothing left. His bandaged right arm glowed golden as a small black sphere appeared in the palm of his hand. He admired the potent ball of chakra for a moment before throwing it straight down into the bubble of water beneath him and quickly jumping away. Reaching what he determined to be a safe distance from the massive bubble, he turned around to watch what happened next. Tao Mini Bijudama, the black sphere of ultra-compressed chakra reached 2/3 of the way down the bubble before it suddenly expanded to 6 times its previous size and then just as quickly collapsed into a pinprick of blackness. The water sphere rippled for a moment and then lost cohesion and imploded, erupting upward, leaving naught but a crater where acres of forest had flourished only minutes before. Deciding that his task was finally complete, Naruto raised his right leg and brought the attached foot crashing back down to the ground. Doten. Dichidakaku almost immediately the massive crater began to invert itself, as if a giant stood beneath it, forcing it flat once more. Once the crater had realigned with the surrounding area, the shinobi readied his final jutsu. Mokutin Hijutsu. Jukai Kouten. With the pulse of his chakra, the ground around him exploded and gave way to hundreds of trees being birthed from the earth. They grew at a frantic pace, coiling and twisting together like writhing serpents, only stopping when they grew even in height with the surrounding forest. Naruto observed his work, noting that the once barren clearing was now indistinguishable from the woodland around it. Nodding sharply to himself, he spun on his heel and took 3 steps before disappearing in a golden flash. The Grey Sparrow Guild was no more. 1 hour before Grey Sparrow's destruction, Naruto trudged through the streets of Dawn City on the west coast of Fiori, only notable for being a rest stop for those traveling from Gallows Town to Matsu Valley. However, the blonde was not here for a rest break, he had no intention of making it to Matsu Valley. No, his quarry was much closer to Dawn City, he just wasn't sure where. Naruto was sure that her job had been in the city, Mavis had told him that much. And he was certain that the only guild around for miles was one called Grey Sparrow, this he had learned from one quivering shopkeep before the man collapsed in a dead faint from the immense pressure of the shinobi's bloodlust. So it was that the only thing left to do now was find out where exactly the guild was located, as none of the citizens in town seemed willing to divulge this information. It was hard to tell what scared the townsfolk more, the ruthless guild that took advantage of their lack of security, or the strange blonde who looked ready to slaughter the next person to glance his way. Luckily for the terrified civilians, their choice was taken away from them before anything too terrible could happen. Noticing a hush fall over the already subdued crowd in the marketplace, Naruto spared a glance at where the silence spread from and almost smiled when he finally found what he was looking for. Standing at the opposite end of marketplace were 3 men ranging from their early 20s to mid-30s. What set them apart from the rest of the crowd were the matching tattoos that adorned their bodies in easily visible positions. One on a man's cheek, another on a muscled right forearm, and the last on a shirtless man's chest. A bird with sharp angular wings flared up as if in mid-flight, and a cruel, sharpened beak looking overly large compared to the small size of its head. The mark of a Grey Sparrow mage. A surge of anger erupted within Naruto, and his bloodlust spiked accordingly, becoming a nearly tangible presence around him. Those closest to him saw their death play out in front of them like a movie and blacked out from the sheer, unrivaled terror they felt. It was unlike anything they had or would ever encounter in their lives. The Grey Sparrow mages stiffened at the terrible feeling but were far enough from its source that they pushed it away and glared at the imposing presence in an attempt to hide their terrified shaking. The marketplace cleared abruptly, with those able to withstand the pressure being forced upon them, grabbing those less fortunate and hurrying back to their homes to avoid whatever was about to happen. Naruto, uncaring of the fleeing townspeople, strode determinedly toward the trio of guild members, stopping less than a foot from the tallest one's face. The shinobi's chosen target was the man with the forearm tattoo. He was taller than his compatriots by a good 6 inches and stood above the 6-foot-tall Naruto by about 3 inches. He was well muscled and had scars running up and down his arm, one split his guild mark in half down the middle, making it look as if the sparrow's wings had been severed where they sprouted from its back. His head was shaved, but he wore a full goatee of coarse black hair. He had one large scar running jaggedly from his left eyebrow to midway atop his head. Overall he struck an very imposing figure, if you were anyone but Naruto. The blonde simply stared coolly into the eyes of the taller man, ignoring his comrades as they were insignificant to his current plans. Given a moment to adjust to the cloaked man's presence, the bald man collected himself and sneered at the impetuous blonde who had the gall to invade his personal space. "Fuck do you want, kid?" He asked the shinobi as his two friends moved to either side of the cloaked man. Naruto just continued to stare at the taller man, refusing to even acknowledge the other two's movements. Finally he opted to speak. "You're in Gray Sparrow." It wasn't a question so much as a declaration. When he received a scoff followed by an affirming nod, Naruto continued, "You are going to show me to your guild." The sparrows chuckled at the blonde kid's idiocy. He thought he could just come up and tell them what to do. Didn't he know who he was talking to? Gray Sparrow was the most powerful guild west of Crocus. Nobody could touch them, and this kid thought he could just come up and make demands of them. Ha. As if. The bald-headed man leaned down until he was nose to nose with Naruto before he spoke. "And what makes you think that we're gonna take you anywhere, punk?" Blinking at the man's wretched breath, Naruto amended his earlier statement. "You misunderstand. You will be taking me to your guild. Your friends won't be going anywhere." "And why is it that you think my buddies won't be going anywhere, huh?" The tall man asked, taking a step back to once more demonstrate the height difference between the two. For the first time that day, Naruto's expression changed from that of blankness to a soulless smile that seemed entirely out of place on his face. His lips quirked up at the corners, but no other part of his face so much as twitched as he stared down the mage in front of him. They were both silent for a tense 15 seconds until the blonde finally spoke. "Dead men don't move very far." The deadpan delivery threw off the sparrows for a few moments, and that was all it took. In a flash of movement, Naruto shot his arms out to either side, a kunai gripped in each hand. They quickly found purchase in the smaller sparrows' throats, where they stayed for an instant until they were forcibly torn from the sides of their necks in a shower of arterial blood. The knives continued on their journey only to once more find a home, this time slotted neatly in the shoulder joints of the bald sparrow. For a moment all was still, save for the blood running in waves from the throats of the two smaller mages and the incredulous looks on all three of their faces. The moment was broken when the throatless mages toppled backwards and hit the ground, dead. The crumpling body set off the bald mage, and he let loose an anguished and horrified scream, gaping dumbly at his now useless arms dangling limply at his sides. Naruto waited for the man's scream to taper off into stunned silence before proceeding to grab his kunai, apply a layer of ultra-sharp wind chakra, and rip downwards, cleanly severing the mage's scarred arms from the rest of his body. To prevent him from bleeding to death, Naruto quickly built up a massive fire-nature chakra in his palms, not at all dissimilar to the first step of a Chidori, and cupped them over the disfigured area, cauterizing the wounds in an instant. Seeing the man's eyes beginning to roll into his head, Naruto slapped him sharply across the face in an effort to prevent him from going into shock. It seemed to work, as the man's eyes regained a bit of clarity and he stared, horrified at Ninja. Seeing coherence return to the man, Naruto reminded him of why he was here in the first place. "So," he stated calmly as if he hadn't just killed two men and permanently disfigured another, "you were going to point me in the direction of your guild, were you not?" He paused and considered his words. "Well, I suppose you won't be doing much pointing in the near future, will you?" He emphasized this with a shrug and a slight gesture down at the sparrow's missing appendages. He made a dismissive noise and focused back on the mage. "Just nod your head in the direction your guild is in and you'll be free to go. If you move quick enough, you might be able to get some fully working prosthetics attached before your nerves atrophy and become useless." There was, of course, no chance of that actually happening. Naruto had seen to that when he cauterized the wounds and burned away any connective tissue that could be used as a base for the prosthetic to attach to. But dead men didn't need to know such things. The mage, who had by this point fallen to his knees from the pain, stared fearfully at Naruto for a moment and then finally opened his mouth to speak. "SS Southeast. T towards the M mountain." He tilted his head in the general direction he spoke of, and in the distance it was indeed possible to see the peak of a snow-capped mountain peeking above the trees. 15k kilometers that way. He continued, unprompted. Naruto gazed down at the stuttering mess of a man, trying to ascertain the truth of his claims. Seeing the defeated and terrified look in the man's eyes, he decided that the sparrow had no reason to lie at this point and so took him at his word. Without another sound, he tightened the grip on the kunai in his right hand and plunged it into the man's forehead. The skewered man's expression registered a moment of shock before he went slack and, with the removal of the knife from his head, dropped to the ground in a heap. But the thought, 3 Bunshin appeared around him. He turned to the nearest one and ordered, "Clean this up. No sense traumatizing these people more than we already have." He gestured at the rows of building with dozens of pairs of eyes peeking out from behind closed curtains. Giving their creator a nod, the three clones set to work. Two collected the bodies to bring them outside of town before burning them to ash, while the third used a small suitin jutsu to wash away the puddles of blood pooled along the cobbled street. Meanwhile, the real Naruto set off at a blistering pace in the direction of the distant mountain and presumably the Gray Sparrow Guild. 10 minutes of sprinting later, Naruto spied a tall wooden building through a gap in the trees. Breaking into the clearing, he glanced up and saw the emblem seated atop the structure, the same one tattooed on the men he'd just killed. Good. He'd found it. Slowing to a walk, the blonde made his way to the large double doors adorning the front of the guild. Without pause, Naruto pushed the oaken doors open and stepped into the guild, pausing just inside the doorway. In an instant, the noises in the hall stopped as the guild members sneered at the boyish newcomer. "Ah fuck do I want, kid?" A mage from the table closest to the door asked. "You can't just come barging in here like you own the place." A brunette woman a few tables over called over to the man who spoke. "Oh, don't be like that, Blaine. Cuties like him are always welcome here. Us girls get tired of staring at your ugly mug day in and day out, you know." A few other women seated around her table tittered in amusement. Naruto ignored the byplay and simply looked around at the packed guild hall. Large round tables dotted the open room, all of them filled with rough-looking men and women who, prior to his arrival, seemed to be imbibing and laughing at each other's stories. Though he couldn't see all of them, he knew they all bore the mark of the gray sparrow on their bodies. And even if they didn't, they were guilty by association. That was enough for him. "Which one of you killed her?" The mages around him gave him bemused looks. Someone in the back corner of the room answered him. "We kill a lot of people around here, buddy. You're gonna have to be more specific." He chuckled in what he thought was a menacing tone, and a few others snickered as well. Naruto didn't seem put off by the response. He simply turned his sharp gaze to the man who spoke and elaborated. "Last night. The fairy tale mage doing the job in Dawn City." That got a response. A short stocky man sitting at a table placed dead center in the room guffawed loudly. "Wahahaha. She was a fun one. Squealed like a stuck pig she did. Hootin' and hollerin' and crying out DT don't kill me. Please. I'll do anything. Gahaha-ack." Before the man could blink, he found the handle of a blade jutting from his throat. His eyes widened and he flailed his arms around wildly, gurgling and drooling blood from his mouth. He turned to look back at Blonde to see him toss an exact replica of the knife in his neck up into the air. There was a flash of yellow and he was staring at the blonde's cloak, inches from his face. Another disorientating flash and the skewered man and the ninja were standing by the doors, exactly where the cloaked man was not moments before. Naruto caught the twirling kunai out of the air and spun the bleeding mage around to face the rest of his guild. His fellow mages were in an uproar, rising from their seats and preparing to attack the intruder holding their friend hostage. Before they could begin their assault though, a rough voice called out from behind them. "Enough. Shut up, will you?" An older man, probably around 60, stepped forward from behind the bar in the back of the hall. His shoulder-length gray hair hung limp from his thinning scalp and his bushy mustache twitched agitatedly as he stared at his guild members. His black beady eyes shifted to the shinobi and he gave the man a congenial smile, raising his hands placatingly. Now, no need to be hasty here. I can see that you're angry, but surely there's no need to resort to violence. Dicey there was only doing his job when he killed that girl. You can understand that, can't you? Everyone's got to make a living somehow. It's hardly our fault that someone somewhere wanted her dead now, is it?" The man's blasé dismissal of his friend's murder only served to stoke the cold raging burning in Naruto's gut, but he couldn't act on it just yet. He needed answers first. "You say someone put in a request to kill her. Who? Why her specifically?" The gray-haired man, who Naruto assumed was the master, just chuckled. No, not her specifically. The request was just for one dead fairy tale mage to be left in a high-traffic area where people would see them. The little girlie just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. As for who placed the request, we dunno. Some guy came in last week wearing a cloak, sorta like yours, but with a hood up. Couldn't see his face. Just walked right in, tacked a request to the board over there, and turned and left. Didn't say a word and was only here for 15 seconds tops. We weren't gonna take it at first cause how suspicious it was. Thought it could have been a trap, you know. Council trying to catch us up to no good and all that. But the pay was too good to pass up. 3 million jewels for one dead mage. Didn't even have to be a strong one, just anyone dumb enough to go walking around with a fairy tale stamp in plain sight. Naruto sighed at this revelation. "So you're all useless then?" The master looked affronted. "Hey now, you listen here boy, I've been kind so far, letting you waltz on in here and attack my men without provocation. I've even given you answers to the questions you had about your little friend's death, so keep that slippery little tongue to yourself. Besides, Daichi there looks dead on his feet and if you think one little meat shield is gonna keep us from killing you, well, you're dead wrong." By the end of his speech, the master's frown had morphed into a sinister grin. "Now boys and girls, go on and show our friend here why you don't fuck with Gray SP. Wait." Naruto called, stopping the mages from charging for the moment. "What is it boy? You want to beg for your life? We're not gonna let you go now that you've gone and killed one of our own. We don't take kindly to that." Naruto shook his head at the master. "No, it's not that. I just wanted to check something first. He took the knife not embedded in Daichi's neck and plunged it into the man's abdomen, drew it across his body, and then pulled it out in one fluid motion, simultaneously pulling the other kunai free as well. Daichi, along with his guildmates, stared down at his intestines slipping out of the gash in his gut and pooling down at his feet for a few seconds. Suddenly, he let loose a gurgling, terrified scream, took a stumbling step forward, slipped on his extraneous entrails, and fell to the floor where he remained, unmoving. Huh. Naruto shrugged, placing the bloody kunai back beneath his cloak. I just don't see it. He admitted, shaking his head. The master gaped at the young man who just butchered one of his mages. What? Just don't see what? He asked, almost dreading the answer. All of a sudden he wasn't so sure he wanted to fuck with this guy anymore. Naruto nudged the pile of cooling flesh with his foot, staring at the master with an almost disappointed look on his face. Daichi here said it was funny that my friend squealed like a stuck pig when he killed her. I just wanted to see what I was missing out on. But I didn't see what was so funny about it. He turned his gaze on the rest of the guild. Did you all think it was funny? The curious look on his face almost looked genuine were it not for the gleam in his eyes that spoke of contained fury. Without waiting for an answer, he suddenly shifted subjects. I don't really enjoy killing. To be honest, I hate it. In fact, I usually go out of my way to avoid killing my enemies, but the last few hours have put me in a very, very bad mood. So today, I'm going to make an exception. Today, I'm going to kill all of you. Your deaths are going to be extremely painful. I'm not killing you to send a message though. No, quite the opposite actually. No one is going to know that you've died, in fact, no one will know that you were ever alive to begin with. I'm going to erase every shred of evidence that Grey Sparrow ever existed. And then, when I'm done here, I'm going to do the same to every other guild who received a job request similar to yours. I'm telling you this because, before you die, I want you all to realize just how big of a mistake you made by fucking with Fairy Tail, and, more importantly, by thinking you could attack me and mine without severe repercussions. But that, he attacked. He twisted to his left to face the table closest to him and sent out a scything blade of wind on a slight angle toward the 5 mages standing there. The movements were so quick and unexpected that the unfortunate men could do nothing but scream as their bodies were neatly bisected at varying points along their torsos. The sight of their comrades being killed snapped the rest of the guild out of their stupor and they began to fight back. The long-range fighters went first, sending a plethora of spells at the stationary sage. Naruto sidestepped an earthen spire that erupted through the floorboards, ducked under a slow-moving fireball, and batted away a bolt of lightning with a wind-encased fist, sending it streaking into an unfortunate mage to his right. He gathered lightning chakra in his right hand and pointed it at the table with the earth mage. Todori Senbon, hundreds of ultra-thin needles shot out at the clumped-up mages, digging into and then through the pliable flesh, leaving the men to fall in twitching, bleeding heaps on the floor as thousands of volts intermittently discharged in their systems. Ignoring their cries of pain, he focused back on the fight as the more physically inclined mages attacked en masse. When the first mage got to be about 10 feet away, she threw a powerful punch at Naruto. He watched with a small bit of amusement as her arm stretched forward bonelessly. The blonde simply caught the enclosing fist with his left hand and gave a sharp tug, yanking the woman from her feet and sending her careening, wide-eyed toward Naruto. The sage brought his right hand into a fist and delivered a crushing blow to the woman's jaw, shattering it and sending teeth and blood flying through the air. Before she could follow them, Naruto gave another pull on her still-caught fist and when she was within range, sent a roundhouse kick into her gut, releasing her fist as she was sent to crash against the guild's wall, splintering the wood upon impact. Not given room to recover, he backstepped as 2 sword-wielding men lunged from either side of him. When they passed in front of him, he brought 2 swirling Rasengan slamming down into their backs, snapping their spines and grinding innards to mush. Another fireball, followed by a small speedy mage came next, and Naruto shot out a large globe of water, easily extinguishing the fireball and clipping the wide-eyed speedster behind it on his arm. He backstepped once more as 3 mages charged him, aiming high, middle, and low, in an effort to catch him off guard. Their hopes were dashed when he simply jumped over all 3 of them and sent a powerful burst of air from his feet, flattening the 3 mages to the floor and subsequently propelling himself to the ceiling where he hung upside down. Before the long-range attackers could make their move, Naruto sent a searing ball of flames into their midst to scatter them, setting a few of the slower ones alight in the process. Removing a few kunai from beneath his cloak, he tossed them at random into the crowd. When none of them struck any of the mages, a few of the men jeered at the blonde for his apparent inability. Within moments, those who were laughing at the man's poor aim suddenly found themselves short a few limbs as Naruto Hiraishin added to each kunai, infused it with wind chakra, and then swung indiscriminately at anything in his way. One final Hiraishin brought him out of the group of dismembered mages, and he took a moment to observe his work so far. He'd incapacitated or outright eliminated about half of the guild's mages so far, and many of the remaining fighters looked hesitant to attack him. That was fine, he'd go to them. A single cage bunchen appeared next to him and immediately tackled the first mage he came across in a bear hug. A beat. The clone exploded in a ball of flames. The bunchen Daibakuha turned its immediate victim into a fine mist and tore limbs from others who stood too close to the blast. Naruto came bursting through the smoke left by the attack and thrust a Rasengan into one man's face, then spun on his heel, hardened his skin with a quick Domu, and sent a fist through the next mage's ribsage. He used the man's body as a makeshift shield to guard himself from a salvo of magic gunshots and then dropped it when they paused to reload. He released a pulse of chakra that had tree roots bursting from the floor to strangle the panicking gunman and turned to deal with his final few opponents. They seemed to be gathering together to make one large last-ditch attempt at overpowering him. They were either extremely brave or extremely ignorant if they thought that only a dozen mediocre mages pooling their power together was going to be enough to stop him. He thrust his arm forward and a small sharp spear of wood launched from his palm. It burrowed into one man's stomach and grew rapidly in several directions, erupting from a multitude of places throughout his body in a shower of gore. The rest of the mages hurriedly backpedaled to buy some time. When they reached a distance they considered safe from most of his ranged attacks, they quickly gathered their magic and released their spells as one. The bastardized unison raid barreled toward Naruto as a cylinder of pure magic, larger in diameter than he was tall. Not even blinking at the extremely destructive wave of energy headed straight for him, Naruto called up two differently natured Rasen Shuriken, one in each hand. Cocking his arm back, he hurled the Yoten Rasen Shuriken at the oncoming beam of energy. It carved its way, without issue, through the mass of light, diffusing the beam into a plethora of smaller blasts that shot off in all directions. When it reached the mages, who had paused to gawk at the mighty spell they had unintentionally produced, it detonated in a deluge of molten lava, covering the group of mages who immediately began howling in agony. Their screams only went on for a few seconds before Naruto threw the Suiton Rasen Shuriken in his left hand. When it reached them, the razor-sharp water sliced through the thick coat of lava on the melting mages, followed by the mages themselves, and then the whole thing imploded, pumping hundreds of gallons of water into the area. The cool temperature of the water set the lava to hardening almost immediately, sealing the dismembered and dying mages into tombs of volcanic stone. Naruto was about to turn and head outside to finish things, but he noticed something off. He couldn't seem to remember killing the guild master who he'd been speaking to didn't surprise the ninja one bit. The slimy old man hardly seemed the type to stick around and fight for his comrades when the chips were down. He couldn't have gotten far though, so Naruto glanced around at the wrecked guild hall, searching for any clue of his whereabouts. Spotting the only viable hiding place left in the building, the immortal man turned and strolled leisurely to the half-collapsed bar against the back wall. Indeed, when he arrived at the counter and poked his head over, he was greeted with the sight of the wrinkled man curled in the fetal position and breathing as silently as possible. Hearing the floor creak, the master looked up into the bloodied face of the man who just slaughtered his entire guild. With a terrified shout, the man morphed himself into a formless cloud of smoke and rushed past the blonde and toward the doors to the guild in a desperate bid for freedom. He was summarily denied when a compressed ball of wind shot through his form and decompressed into omnidirectional gale force winds that buffeted said form and forced the smoke to every corner of the guild hall. The expanding wind suddenly stopped, only to be replaced by what could only be a miniature black hole. It sucked up his dispersed form into a tightly packed ball and brought with it dismembered limbs and a few of the closest corpses. In an effort to avoid being buried under his dead subordinates, the master reassembled himself and pushed with all his might to escape the vacuum behind him. After an almighty struggle that exhausted most of his strength, he managed to free himself and tumble clumsily into the waiting embrace of Naruto's right hand. The ninja seemed quite unfazed by the miniature tornado that was only now beginning to taper off. Aside from the blood that soaked his entire body from head to toe, the blonde seemed as though he hadn't done anything even remotely strenuous since he woke up that morning. Naruto hoisted the shorter guild master up by his neck until they were eye level. "Your entire guild just died fighting while you cowered behind the bar doing absolutely nothing. They may have been a bunch of child-murdering assholes, but at least they had the guts to go down fighting instead of turning into a bunch of sniveling pussies and giving up like you did." In response, the guild master spat at the blonde's bloody face. Naruto stared unflinchingly at the old man for a few moments and then shrugged. He spat back at the master, his loogie landing square in the middle of the man's forehead. But unlike the master's spit, Naruto's began to sizzle and pop with a high-pitched hissing sound. Naruto's spit, infused with the acidic chakra of what was once the Rakubi, slowly began eating its way through the skin and bone of the man's wrinkled forehead. With the blonde's hand crushing his windpipe, the master could only flail and kick helplessly at the imposing ninja, screaming mutely as the acid worked its way into his brain. When the master finally went limp, Naruto dropped his body to the floor and once more looked at the destruction he'd wrought. He let out a weary sigh and shook his head. This was a mistake. He thought that killing these people would soothe his pain in some way, give him a sense of justice that the ones who'd killed her couldn't kill anyone again. But all it did was leave him empty. He'd let his rage get the better of him, and in the end he was no better than these people. And to make it worse, there were about a dozen other things he should be doing right now. He should be home, at Fairy Tale with his family. They needed him right now. Needed someone to guide them through this dark time. Someone with experience in dealing with death. And again, if this was his idea of a healthy reaction to a loved one dying, perhaps they were better off without him there. No. That didn't matter. He should be there for them. For her. There would be time to investigate this later. Time to figure out how Fairy Tale had gathered enough attention within just 2 months of being founded to warrant someone putting out hits on their mages. But for now, his family was his first priority. This whole thing was a mess. It needed to be cleaned up. He looked down at the blood staining his hands and then turned to leave the building. 24 hours before Grey Sparrow's destruction. For the first time in centuries, Naruto could honestly say that he was content with life. Not since the ninja villages had dissolved some 800 years ago had he found a place that he could truly call home. Until now, that is. Fairy Tale was quickly becoming the greatest thing to happen to him in ages. The 6 of them had already recruited a few new mages that had wandered through after hearing about the defeat of Blue Skull. Their curiosity had brought them straight to Fairy Tale's doorstep, where Mavis's bubbling personality and innate friendliness quickly reeled them in. More and more jobs were coming in, and each request was being completed in record time, with glowing praise coming from their employers. At the behest of Mavis and the constant ribbing from Yuri and Warad, Naruto himself had even taken a few jobs. It had been a long time since he'd performed a task given to him by someone that wasn't himself. It was quite nostalgic for the ancient man. But as much fun as nostalgia could be, he had things of his own that he had to keep up on, and so didn't have time to take more than a mission or 2 each month. Now that he thought about it, it was getting around that time when he had to head back to the guild to check up on things and make sure the rowdy group of mages hadn't burned the place to the ground. Now how to get back? He could take a nice leisurely walk to enjoy the sights and arrive back in Magnolia in about 3 days, or he could hurration to any of the dozen or so markers he had in and around the guild and arrive in 3 seconds. Before he could contemplate any further, he felt an insistent tugging in the back of his head from one of the Hurration kunai that he had left at the guild in case of emergency. He patted himself down to make sure he had everything he needed with him and flashed away the next instant. He arrived in a hallway that he knew to be off the main floor of the guild and knew instantly that something was wrong. For one, the boisterous laughter and cheerful shouting of the Fairy Tale mages was noticeably absent. The second, and most telling thing, was the 3 ashen-faced men hovering in front of Mavis's office. Yuri's head rested against the door, and his hand was poised as if he'd been knocking, quite insistently if the redness of his knuckles was any indication. Warad sat hunched over on the floor looking utterly defeated and hopeless. Precht was leaning coolly against the wall, arms crossed over his chest and brow furrowed, but his lone eye stared forlornly at the ground, and he seemed to be lost in thought. Naruto assumed that Precht was the one to signal him, as he was the only one who looked up at the blonde's arrival. "What's going on, Precht? Why did you call me?" Naruto gave the one-eyed man a curious look. The 3 men's destroyed expressions were not setting his mind at ease in the least. "She's gone and locked herself in there after we got the call from the Rune Knights. She won't let any of us in and I'm worried she'll do something stupid if we don't get in there. She's put up a load of runes in front of the door and windows that we don't know how to bypass. You're the only one I know who can, and we figured you'd be the best choice to calm her down right now." Precht's explanation only made Naruto more anxious. Giving the man a nod, Naruto felt for the marker that he knew would be in the office. Finding it, he disappeared in a flash of gold. The office was in complete and utter disarray. The desk had been overturned and the papers and books on top of it scattered around the room. The bookshelf was snapped in 2 and its contents joined everything else strewn across the floor. Glass trinkets were shattered and a flag bearing the crest of Fairy Tale lay half torn and dangling from its spot on the wall. Amongst all of the destruction, a minuscule blonde girl sat curled in a corner. Deep, racking sobs came without pause and her hands fisted tightly in her hair as if she were trying to tear it out. It was to this scene that Naruto arrived, standing toe-to-toe with a grieving girl. He immediately crouched down and engulfed her in a comforting hug. She responded without hesitation, clinging desperately to the immortal. He lifted Mavis up and shifted around a bit until his back was leaned against the wall and then set her down in his lap and began stroking her hair. She kept her grip on his cloak like a vice until he managed to calm her down enough to speak coherently. "Tell me what's wrong, Mavis. I can't do anything to help you if you don't tell me the problem. Tell me what it is and I'll go fix it, I swear." He whispered into her hair as her face was still buried in his chest. She broke into another round of sobs that lasted a few more minutes. Finally she mumbled something incomprehensible into Naruto's chest. "Say that again, Mavis. I can't hear you." He pulled her head from its spot beneath his cloak and lifted her chin until he could look into her face. What he saw though, terrified him. Her eyes looked dead. She looked as if she had never been happy and would never be happy again. It was the look of someone who had lost all hope and faith in the world. Avis steeled herself and stared into her best friend's face. The Rune Knights called on the communication Lacrima. Zera is dead. Naruto broke. Manga spoilers bellow. What if Naruto is an immortal wanderer in fairy tale? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part. Comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys next video.